Fidel Castro survived more than 600 documented assassination attempts while transforming a Caribbean island into a revolutionary beacon. This deep dive reveals his journey from Jesuit student to guerrilla commander, covering the Granma landing, socialist reforms, surviving the Soviet collapse, and his leadership in the non-aligned movement. You will witness how his education and healthcare transformations reshaped Cuba, while his charismatic oratory defied decades of US opposition. Fidel Castro spent his early years in the rural settlement of Barran, Cuba. He was born on his father's Sizabal sugar plantation in August 1926. His father, Nigel Castro Yargis, was a wealthy landowner who had immigrated from Spain. The family lived in relative comfort, a stark contrast to the lives of the agricultural workers on their estate. This environment provided young Fidel with a unique perspective on social and economic disparities from a very young age. His early education began at home before he was sent to a small local school in Santiago de Cuba. Later, he attended private Catholic schools, including the renowned Colegio de Dolores and Colegio de Belén in Havana. Research has shown that his formative years in this privileged, yet isolated setting were pivotal. Some analyses suggest his exposure to the harsh realities of plantation labor planted early seeds of dissent against the established order. Childhood acquaintances recalled a headstrong and competitive boy. One schoolmate noted, "He was always arguing, always wanting to be the leader in our games." Another described him as possessing a fierce sense of justice even then. These early character traits, observed by those who knew him, would later become defining features of the revolutionary leader. His upbringing, rooted in the very system he would eventually seek to overthrow, created a profound personal contradiction that shaped his future path. Yet this fiery sense of justice would soon be tested and sharpened in an environment far removed from the fields of his youth. Fidel Castro's formative education unfolded within the disciplined walls of Jesuit institutions, most notably at the Colegio de Belén in Havana. He attended this prestigious school from the age of 15, immersing himself in a rigorous curriculum that blended classical studies with strict Catholic doctrine. This environment was pivotal in shaping his intellectual framework. The Jesuit emphasis on discipline, moral certainty, and structured argumentation provided him with a powerful toolkit for logical reasoning and leadership. However, this very education also sowed the seeds of profound contradiction. The school taught social justice principles rooted in Catholic teaching, yet it operated within a society marked by stark inequality. This dissonance between preached ideals and observed reality became a critical point of tension for the young student. Specific educators left a significant mark on his development. Father Armando Laurent, a young and energetic teacher, is often cited as a key influence. He encouraged Castro's competitive spirit in debates and intellectual pursuits, reportedly telling him he had the makings of a great leader. This mentorship fostered Castro's oratorical skills and self-confidence. Simultaneously, his political awareness began to crystallize. He engaged with historical texts and current events, developing a critical perspective on Cuban politics and American influence. While the Jesuit system aimed to create faithful servants of the established order, for Castro, it ultimately forged a revolutionary mindset. The tools of structured thought and moral conviction he acquired were later redirected toward challenging the very system his education was designed to uphold. This revolutionary mindset would soon find its natural proving ground when he continued his formal education. Fidel Castro arrived at the University of Havana in 1945, entering a cauldron of intense political fervor. The campus was a microcosm of national tensions, dominated by violent student gangs and fierce ideological battles. Castro immediately immersed himself in this volatile environment, joining the university committee for the struggle for Dominican independence. His early activities were not merely academic, they involved direct, physical confrontations. He quickly gained a reputation as a charismatic and combative orator, his political identity forged in the heat of student politics. His exposure to anti-imperialist thought deepened significantly during these years. He voraciously studied the works of José Martí and absorbed ideas from nationalist and leftist movements across Latin America. Researchers have noted his growing conviction that Cuba's sovereignty was compromised by foreign powers, particularly the United States. This ideological shift was not abstract, it directly fueled his actions. In April 1948, he traveled to Bogotá, Colombia during the nascent 9th Pan-American Conference. The eruption of the Bogotazo massive urban riots following the assassination of populist leader Sir Gaetan provided a seismic, real-world lesson in popular insurrection. Castro was present on the streets, witnessing the raw power of a spontaneous uprising. Experience that analysis has shown profoundly shaped his revolutionary tactics. These university years were a critical incubation period for his revolutionary ambitions. He began organizing beyond campus, connecting with figures involved in plotting against Caribbean dictatorships. His involvement in an armed expedition to overthrow Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, though the mission ultimately failed, marked a definitive transition from student activist to aspiring revolutionary. The university did not just educate him, it armed him with a radical ideology and the practical experience that would define his future command. This radicalization through direct action would soon find its next outlet in a series of international ventures, beginning with an even earlier expedition. Fidel Castro's health began showing visible decline in the early 2000s. Public appearances grew less. His movements appeared slower and more deliberate. By 2006, a major crisis unfolded. In late July, Castro experienced a severe intestinal ailment. This required emergency surgery. He temporarily transferred power to his brother Russell. The Cuban government released limited details about his condition. This secrecy fueled intense international speculation. The situation created significant political tension. For months, the commandant remained out of public view. Official statements were vague, referring only to a health crisis. This lack of transparency led to widespread rumors. Some analysts believed he had diverticulitis. Others speculated about stomach cancer. The uncertainty extended to Cuba's political future. Many observers questioned if Fidel would return to full authority. Studies later indicated this period tested the country's succession protocols. His public reemergence was gradual and carefully managed. When Castro appeared in videos, he seemed noticeably thinner and weaker. These controlled appearances contrasted sharply with his former vigor. Analysis revealed his governing capacity was fundamentally altered. He no longer delivered long, impromptu speeches. His role shifted to writing opinion pieces termed reflections. This change demonstrated a clear reduction in his direct involvement in daily governance. The prolonged illness effectively marked the end of his hands-on leadership style, paving the way for a new political era in Cuba. This gradual withdrawal from active leadership consequently necessitated a formal succession plan, which would systematically transfer authority over the coming years. The formal transfer of power to Rafael Castro was a meticulously orchestrated process that unfolded over 2 years, beginning in July 2006. When Fidel Castro underwent emergency intestinal surgery, he provisionally ceded his duties as President of the Council of State, Commander-in-Chief, and First Secretary of the Communist Party to his brother. This was not an ad hoc decision, but a constitutional procedure utilizing Article 94 of the Cuban Constitution, which allowed for the temporary delegation of authority. This institutional mechanism provided immediate stability and signaled a pre-arranged succession plan, directly challenging widespread international predictions of a political collapse or a power vacuum. The provisional transfer became permanent in February 2008, when Fidel Castro officially announced he would not accept another term as head of state. The National Assembly of People's Power then formally elected Rafael Castro as President of the Council of State and Council of Ministers. This seamless transition was facilitated by the existing party-state apparatus, which ensured continuity. The military and the Communist Party, both institutions where Rafael had cultivated deep loyalty for decades, provided the essential backing for a smooth handover. Analysis has shown that this structured process effectively neutralized potential internal conflicts and demonstrated the resilience of Cuba's single-party system in managing leadership changes. Throughout this period, Fidel Castro's role evolved significantly. He relinquished executive control but did not disappear from public life. He began writing a regular newspaper column titled Reflections of the Comrade-in-Chief, offering commentary on global affairs. This allowed him to assume the mantle of an elder statesman and a revolutionary ideologue, influencing the political discourse without directly governing. Researchers have noted that this created a unique dynamic of dual authority, where Rafael managed the day-to-day state affairs while Fidel's symbolic power and historical legacy continued to cast a long shadow over the nation's direction, ensuring his ideological presence remained a potent force in Cuban politics. Yet this influential presence from the sidelines would soon give way to a life even further removed from the public eye. Following his formal retirement in 2008, Fidel Castro entered a period of life largely shielded from public view. Yet he remained an active commentator on world affairs. His primary platform became a series of newspaper columns titled Reflections, published in Cuban state media. Through these writings, he analyzed global events, from environmental crises to international political conflicts, consistently framing them through his lifelong ideological lens. He often expressed concerns about nuclear war and climate change, urging his readers to remain vigilant. His public appearances became rare and carefully orchestrated. One notable event was his visit to Havana's National Art Gallery in 2012. Another was his meeting with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in 2013. These brief appearances were analyzed globally for signs of his health and political stance. Researchers noted that his mere presence, even without a formal government role, served to legitimize the new administration led by his brother Rathol. Analysis reveals that his reflections were not mere reminiscences but strategic political instruments. They allowed him to shape the narrative of the Cuban Revolution's legacy and offer guidance, or sometimes subtle critique, from the sidelines. While some scholars argue his influence was largely symbolic in these final years, others believe his ideological shadow continued to profoundly impact policy debates within the Communist Party. His writings ensured that his voice, though physically diminished, never fully left the Cuban political landscape until his death in 2016. This enduring ideological presence would ultimately be tested by the physical reality of his passing, which occurred in 2016. Fidel Castro died on November 25, 2016. The Cuban government announced his passing late that evening. They declared a 9-day national mourning period. During this time, public activities halted and flags flew at half-mast. His ashes were taken on a procession retracing his rebel army's route. The journey ended with a burial in Santiago de Cuba. Global reactions to his death were profoundly divided. World leaders like the presidents of Russia and China expressed deep condolences. They praised Castro as a historic figure and a friend. Conversely, celebrations erupted in parts of Miami's Cuban exile community. Many there viewed him as a brutal dictator. This stark contrast highlighted his complex and polarizing legacy on the world stage. Analysis shows his passing truly marked the end of an era. For nearly 6 decades, Castro was synonymous with Cuba. His leadership defied the United States and shaped Cold War politics. Researchers note that his death closed a definitive chapter in 20th century history. It prompted global reflection on revolution, socialism, and national sovereignty. Some analysts believe it accelerated a slow shift in Cuba's relations with other nations. The Comandante's long shadow finally receded, leaving a nation and a world to contemplate his immense impact. But what tangible legacy did this revolutionary era leave on Cuban society itself? The Cuban Revolution produced profound transformations across society. Its educational reforms achieved remarkable success in eradicating illiteracy. Within just a few years of the revolution, a nationwide campaign mobilized thousands of volunteer teachers. This effort dramatically increased literacy rates to over 90%. The government also established a universal and free healthcare system. This system became a model for many developing nations. Life expectancy rose significantly while infant mortality rates fell. These were undeniable achievements in social welfare. However, these social gains existed alongside significant political constraints. The state maintained a single-party system that suppressed dissent. Political opponents faced imprisonment or exile for decades. Research by organizations like Amnesty International documented thousands of cases of political prisoners. The economy presented another complex area. Initial gains were hampered by the United States embargo and dependence on Soviet subsidies. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 plunged Cuba into a severe economic crisis known as the Special Period. This era was marked by widespread shortages and a sharp decline in living standards. Historical interpretations of the revolution's overall impact remain deeply divided. Some analysts argue the social safety net and national sovereignty outweigh the political costs. They point to Cuba's high levels of doctors per capita and its international medical missions. Other scholars contend that the systemic lack of political freedoms and chronic economic inefficiencies have stifled human potential. They highlight the continuous exodus of citizens seeking opportunities abroad. An analysis of economic data reveals a country with strong human development indicators, yet struggling with poverty and infrastructure decay. The revolution's legacy is therefore not a single story but a tapestry of monumental achievements and profound challenges, its final historical assessment still being written by future generations. While this complex legacy continues to unfold, the figure at its very center invites a particularly contested historical judgment. Historians currently assess Fidel Castro's legacy through multiple competing lenses. as an anti-imperialist icon. His defiance of the United States from the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 through decades of economic pressure remains foundational. Studies show this stance secured his symbolic power across the global South, where he is often viewed as a champion of national sovereignty. His government's interventions in Angola and other African nations during the 1970s and 80s cemented this reputation, creating a lasting sphere of influence. His Cold War significance is equally complex. Castro transformed a small Caribbean island into a major player in superpower politics. Analysis reveals his alliance with the Soviet Union was not merely ideological, but a pragmatic survival strategy that lasted over 3 decades. This partnership, however, made Cuba a proxy battlefield, a fact that continues to shape interpretations of his leadership as either dangerously provocative or brilliantly strategic for maintaining independence against a powerful neighbor. As a social reformer, Castro's record presents starkly competing narratives. One perspective highlights universal literacy and a healthcare system that achieved some of the region's lowest infant mortality rates by the 1980s. The revolution's social projects were unprecedented, wrote scholar Richard Gott. Conversely, other analysts point to the economic hardships and political repression that accompanied these achievements. Many experts believe future historical interpretations will increasingly weigh these social gains against the cost in personal freedoms. Ultimately, Castro's place in history remains deeply divided. One school of thought sees a revolutionary titan who defied imperialism. Another views a dictator who centralized power for nearly 50 years. His legacy is not a settled matter but an ongoing debate, with his significance shifting as new generations of historians apply different frameworks, moving beyond the Cold War dichotomy to examine his long-term impact on Cuban society and Latin American politics. The young Fidel Castro first entered the political arena not in Cuba, but through international revolutionary adventures. His initial foray was the Cayo Conflites expedition in 1947, a planned invasion to overthrow the Dominican Republic's dictator, Rafael Trujillo. Although the mission was aborted by the Cuban government before any landing occurred, the experience was formative. Castro witnessed firsthand the complexities and perils of organizing an armed insurrection. Just 1 year later, in 1948, Castro was in Bogotá, Colombia during the explosive riots known as the Bogotazo. He had traveled there for a student anti-imperialist conference, but the assassination of a popular liberal leader plunged the city into chaos. Analysis has revealed that these 2 events profoundly shaped his revolutionary methodology. He saw the disorganized fury of the Bogotazo mobs and contrasted it with the failed, top-down planning of Cayo Conflites. These observations convinced him of the necessity for a highly disciplined, centralized guerrilla force, not spontaneous uprisings. Contemporaries began to note his emerging leadership qualities. One fellow student from that period wrote, "He possessed an undeniable magnetism and a fierce, uncompromising rhetoric that drew others to his cause." This combination of personal charisma and a newly forged strategic doctrine, born from early failures and witnessed chaos, laid the essential groundwork for the revolutionary commander he would become. Yet this emerging leader would soon face the ultimate test of his strategic doctrine in a single defining moment. The Moncada barracks attack represented Fidel Castro's bold first strike against Fulgencio Batista's regime. On July 26, 1953, 138 rebels launched a surprise assault on Cuba's second-largest military fortress in Santiago de Cuba. Castro planned the operation meticulously, believing its capture would ignite a popular uprising. The rebels disguised themselves in army uniforms to approach the barracks during carnival celebrations. Their strategy relied on complete surprise to overcome the garrison's larger force. Execution quickly devolved into chaos. The attack began around 5:15 in the morning amid heavy rain. Several vehicles missed their designated entrances, alerting guards prematurely. One rebel car accidentally crashed into a military patrol, eliminating any remaining stealth. The rebels found themselves outgunned and outnumbered as soldiers mobilized rapidly. After 2 hours of fierce fighting, Castro ordered retreat to prevent complete annihilation. 61 attackers died during the assault, with many captured and executed afterward. The aftermath proved devastating yet transformative. Government forces captured most rebels within days, including Fidel and Raúl Castro. During his October trial, Castro delivered his legendary 4-hour defense speech known as "History Will Absolve Me." He argued the people's right to rebel against tyranny, outlining his revolutionary vision. Historical analysis shows this speech became the ideological foundation for his movement. Though sentenced to 15 years, Castro served only 22 months before amnesty. The failed attack ultimately created his revolutionary identity and martyr mythology. Researchers note the date later named his revolutionary movement, the 26th of July movement, ensuring this failure became central to Cuban revolutionary law. While this failed assault forged his revolutionary identity, the actual period of incarceration would prove equally transformative for Castro's political development. Following the failed Moncada barracks attack, Fidel Castro was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was incarcerated on the Isle of Pines, now known as the Isle of Youth, beginning in 1953. His imprisonment, which lasted for nearly 22 months, became a crucial period of intellectual and strategic development rather than mere confinement. Castro used this time to intensively study political theory and history, refining his revolutionary ideology. He famously drafted his defense speech, "History Will Absolve Me," which was smuggled out and became a foundational document for his movement. This document outlined his vision for a new Cuba, transforming his trial into a platform for his cause. An amnesty campaign led to his release in May 1955. Castro then chose exile in Mexico City, a hub for Latin American revolutionaries. It was here that the strategic planning for an armed insurgency truly took shape. He began assembling a dedicated group of followers, many of whom were fellow Cuban exiles. This period was critical for building international connections and securing resources. One of his most significant meetings was with the Argentine Dr. Ernesto Che Guevara, who shared his revolutionary fervor and became a key strategist. In Mexico, Castro formally established the 26th of July movement, named after the date of the Moncada attack. This organization unified his supporters under a clear political and military banner. Its primary objective was the overthrow of Fulgencio Batista's regime. The movement's formation marked the transition from isolated rebellion to an organized, transnational revolutionary force. Castro and his comrades underwent rigorous military training in preparation for their return to Cuba, setting the stage for the next phase of their struggle. This preparation culminated in their departure from Mexico, where Castro's carefully trained force would embark on a pivotal maritime journey. On November 25, 1956, 82 rebels led by Fidel Castro set sail from Mexico aboard the yacht Granma. Their goal was to overthrow the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. The planned 5-day voyage turned into a 7-day ordeal. The overloaded vessel faced terrible weather, arriving on the Cuban coast at Las Coloradas on December 2nd. The landing itself was a disaster, with the yacht running aground in a mangrove swamp. The men were forced to abandon their equipment and wade through thick mud to reach solid ground, immediately losing the element of surprise. Just 3 days later, on December 5th, their movement was detected. Batista's forces ambushed the exhausted rebels at Alegria de Pio. The encounter was a massacre. Heavily outnumbered and outgunned, the rebel group was decimated. Many were killed on the spot, while others were captured and executed. Research indicates that only a small handful of fighters managed to escape into the surrounding sugarcane fields. From the original force of 82, only 12 men, including Fidel and Raul Castro, Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, survived this initial confrontation. Their revolution seemed utterly crushed. The survivors retreated into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, beginning a new phase of guerrilla warfare. The first months were marked by extreme hardship. They faced severe shortages of food, medicine, and ammunition. Their ranks were slowly rebuilt, one campesino at a time, gaining the crucial support of the local peasantry. Constant government patrols forced them to remain constantly mobile, avoiding direct engagements. Analysis has shown this period was a brutal test of survival, forging the core tactics and resilience that would later define their successful revolutionary campaign. This hard-won survival foundation would soon be tested as their operations expanded, setting the stage for a more complex phase of the conflict. After the difficult early months, Fidel Castro's guerrilla campaign in the Sierra Maestra Mountains entered a crucial phase from 1957. His strategy evolved into a sophisticated model of revolutionary warfare. The primary objective was not to win immediate large-scale battles, but to ensure the movement's survival and gradual expansion. Castro understood that the support of the local campesino population was the key to this. His forces provided medical aid and education, and they consistently paid for any supplies taken from locals. This approach stood in stark contrast to the behavior of Batista's army, which often alienated rural communities through repression. This careful cultivation of a supportive social base created a vital intelligence network and a steady stream of recruits. Militarily, the rebel army perfected hit-and-run tactics. Small, mobile units would ambush government patrols in the familiar, rugged terrain and then disappear back into the mountains. They targeted small army posts to seize weapons and ammunition, carefully avoiding direct confrontation with larger, better-equipped forces. One of the most significant early victories demonstrating this effective strategy was the Battle of El Overo in May 1957. Rebel forces successfully assaulted a well-guarded army garrison, capturing valuable arms and proving their growing combat capability. This victory provided a major morale boost and attracted more volunteers to the cause. Throughout 1958, Castro's control solidified. The establishment of a permanent rebel territory with its own laws and civil administration was a clear challenge to the central government. Key columns, led by commanders like Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, began to push outward from the Sierra Maestra. Their mission was to open new fronts in other provinces, spreading the revolution across the island. The failure of Batista's summer offensive, known as Operation Verano, marked the turning point. The rebel army not only defended its core territory, but also captured vast quantities of weapons from the retreating government troops. This defeat broke the back of Batista's military, paving the way for the final revolutionary offensive in the last months of the year. With Batista's military broken, how would the rebels capitalize on this momentum to bring about the final collapse of the regime? By late 1958, Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces initiated their final, decisive offensive. This multifaceted campaign combined coordinated military assaults with a widespread popular uprising against Fulgencio Batista's regime. The strategy involved three key columns advancing across the island. One column, led by Che Guevara, moved to capture the strategic city of Santa Clara. Another, commanded by Camilo Cienfuegos, advanced toward the key military garrison at Yaguajay. Meanwhile, Castro himself led the main force in a push through the east. The battles for Santa Clara and Yaguajay became iconic symbols of the revolution's final chapter. The battle for Santa Clara, lasting from December 28th to December 31st, proved to be the pivotal engagement. Che Guevara's troops, though outnumbered, successfully derailed an armored train carrying government reinforcements and supplies. This bold maneuver crippled the morale of Batista's army. Simultaneously, the fierce fighting at Yaguajay, where Cienfuegos' forces besieged a determined garrison, culminated in the defenders' surrender on December 31st. These twin defeats shattered the remaining will of the Batista government. As news of the losses spread, a general strike and popular insurrection erupted across Cuba, making the regime's position untenable. Recognizing his imminent defeat, dictator Fulgencio Batista fled the country in the early hours of January 1, 1959. This act marked the collapse of his government. With the path clear, Che Guevara's and Camilo Cienfuegos' victorious columns entered Havana on January 2nd. Their arrival was met with massive public jubilation. Fidel Castro, however, chose a more symbolic approach. He embarked on a prolonged, triumphant caravan across the island, giving speeches to enormous crowds. He finally entered the capital on January 8th, cementing the revolution's ultimate victory and beginning a new era in Cuban history. Yet this triumphant arrival would soon give way to contentious governance, as the new administration's ambitious policies began to take shape. In early 1959, Fidel Castro's revolutionary government initiated a series of sweeping reforms. The most significant was the agrarian reform law enacted in May of that year. This law aimed to redistribute land from large estates to landless peasants, limiting individual landholdings to about 1,000 acres. Shortly after, the urban reform law was passed, drastically reducing rents for city dwellers and allowing tenants to eventually own their homes. These measures were immensely popular among the rural and urban poor, solidifying the government's base of support. However, these same reforms generated significant opposition. The nationalization of large landholdings and foreign-owned properties alienated the former landowning elite and powerful foreign corporations, particularly those from the United States. Research has shown that while the policies addressed deep social inequalities, they also caused an immediate economic disruption. One analysis revealed that the middle class and wealthy Cubans saw their assets and economic standing threatened, creating a fertile ground for dissent. This discontent quickly coalesced into organized opposition. By late 1959 and early 1960, the first armed counter-revolutionary groups known as Los Alzados began operating in the mountainous regions of Cuba, particularly in the Escambray Mountains. Simultaneously, a significant exodus of upper and middle-class Cubans began, many of whom settled in Miami, Florida. These exile communities became the nucleus for future counter-revolutionary movements. As one contemporary observer wrote, the revolution was consolidating its power while its enemies were organizing their response, setting the stage for the escalating conflict of the coming years. As these tensions intensified, the revolutionary government began implementing increasingly radical economic measures that would fundamentally reshape Cuba's relationship with the United States. The year 1960 marked a decisive turn. Fidel Castro's government initiated a sweeping nationalization of American-owned properties in Cuba. This began with oil refineries in June and expanded to include sugar mills, banks, and utility companies by October. These actions were not isolated economic measures. They represented a fundamental break with the United States and its economic dominance on the island. The American response was swift and severe, leading to a near-total economic embargo by the end of the year. This escalating confrontation pushed Cuba toward a new global partner. Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union deepened throughout 1961. Following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April, he publicly declared the socialist character of the Cuban Revolution. In December, he made his most definitive statement, announcing, "I am a Marxist-Leninist and shall be one until the last day of my life." This ideological commitment was cemented by growing economic and military cooperation with the Soviet bloc. The Cold War had arrived in the Caribbean, transforming Cuba into a strategic Soviet ally just 90 miles from American shores. Historians continue to debate whether this was Castro's long-hidden plan or a pragmatic adaptation. One school of thought argues his early writings and the radical core of his history will absolve mess speech reveal a latent Marxist inclination. These analysts suggest the gradual unveiling was a tactical necessity to consolidate power without prematurely alarming moderates. Conversely, other research posits he was primarily a nationalist revolutionary. This interpretation views his turn to Marxism-Leninism as a direct consequence of American hostility. Faced with immense external pressure, he pragmatically embraced the only power willing to offer Cuba economic survival and military protection, locking the nation into a new ideological orbit. This ideological realignment would soon be tested by a direct military confrontation as the United States moved from diplomatic pressure to overt action. The Bay of Pigs invasion began in the pre-dawn hours of April 17, 1961. Codenamed Operation Zapata, this SA-backed force of approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at Playa Girón. Their objective was to overthrow Fidel Castro's government by establishing a beachhead and sparking a national uprising. The Cuban government, however, was not caught by surprise. Extensive intelligence from its revolutionary networks and previous aerial bombardments had alerted the military. Castro himself rushed to the scene, taking direct command of the defense and declaring the action an imperialist attack on Cuban sovereignty. Over the next 3 days, a fierce battle unfolded. The invading Brigade 2506 faced the well-prepared Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces and militia units. The exiles' hopes for air support were dashed when President John F. Kennedy, fearing greater international escalation, cancelled critical second air strikes. Cuban T-33 jets, piloted by skilled aviators, gained control of the skies, sinking supply ships and isolating the invaders on the beach. On the ground, Cuban forces used their knowledge of the swampy terrain to their advantage, surrounding and overwhelming the exile brigade. By April 19th, the invasion had conclusively failed, with most attackers killed or captured. The political consequences were immediate and profound. The failed invasion became a monumental propaganda victory for Fidel Castro. It allowed him to portray himself as the defiant leader who had humiliated the United States, dramatically strengthening his popular support and legitimizing his government. The event crushed internal opposition, as potential dissenters were branded as collaborators with foreign aggression. Historians note that the victory accelerated Cuba's political trajectory, cementing the alliance with the Soviet Union. Within months, Castro publicly declared the socialist character of the Cuban Revolution, paving the way for deeper, more rapid reforms that would reshape the nation's economy and society for decades to come. The Bay of Pigs, intended to topple a leader, instead made him an icon of anti-imperialist resistance. But this newfound alliance would soon draw Cuba into an even more dangerous confrontation, one that would bring the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 placed the small island nation at the epicenter of a global nuclear confrontation. The Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev secretly deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba. This decision aimed to counter the strategic advantage of the United States, which had missiles in Turkey and Italy. For the Soviet leadership, Cuba represented a vital communist ally in the Western Hemisphere. The deployment was a direct and dramatic escalation in the Cold War. Fidel Castro's government saw the missiles as a legitimate act of defense. Cuba had faced the Bay of Pigs invasion just 1 year prior and constant threats from the United States. Castro believed the weapons would deter another invasion and solidify Cuba's sovereignty. He was not merely a passive recipient of Soviet policy. Recent analysis of declassified documents reveals Castro actively urged the Soviets to consider a first nuclear strike if the United States invaded his country. This position, expressed in a letter to Khrushchev, showed a far more militant stance than previously understood. During the 13-day crisis, the world watched as US President John F. Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev negotiated. US President John F. Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev negotiated. Castro was largely excluded from these direct communications. He perceived the final resolution, which involved a secret US pledge to remove its missiles from Turkey, as a betrayal of Cuban security interests. US pledge to remove its missiles from Turkey, as a betrayal of Cuban security interests. The Soviets agreed to withdraw their missiles without his full consent. Declassified Cuban records show profound disappointment in Havana. Officials felt their nation was treated as a bargaining chip rather than a sovereign partner. The crisis fundamentally altered Cuba's revolutionary trajectory. While war was averted, the experience cemented Castro's distrust of superpower negotiations. It reinforced his commitment to an independent, though perilous, path. Studies of the event now highlight how close the world came to catastrophe, with Cuban forces on high alert and local Soviet commanders authorized to use tactical nuclear weapons. The Cuban perspective, long overshadowed, illustrates that the brink of nuclear war was even closer than the Washington-Moscow narrative suggested. This defiant stance on the world stage would soon manifest through ambitious foreign policy, as Cuba sought to extend its influence far beyond its own hemisphere. Fidel Castro's vision of international solidarity extended far beyond Cuba's shores, driving a sustained campaign to export revolutionary ideals. Throughout the 1960s to the 1980s, Cuban military and civilian advisors were deployed to support leftist movements and governments, most notably in Africa. This internationalist policy transformed Cuba into a significant, albeit controversial, actor on the global stage. The Angolan Civil War became the primary theater for Cuban intervention. Starting in 1975, tens of thousands of Cuban combat troops were sent to support the Marxist People's Movement for the liberation of Angola against rival factions and South African forces. This massive deployment, which lasted for more than a decade, was pivotal in major battles such as Quito Cuanavale. Scholars note this engagement not only shaped Angola's outcome, but also contributed significantly to the downfall of apartheid by weakening the South African military. Simultaneously, Cuba intervened in the Ogaden War between Ethiopia and Somalia in 1977. At the request of the Ethiopian government, over 15,000 Cuban soldiers fought alongside Ethiopian forces. This mission aimed to secure a socialist ally in the Horn of Africa and counter Somali territorial ambitions. Analysis reveals these African campaigns served clear strategic goals, advancing a global anti-imperialist front, gaining geopolitical leverage, and fulfilling ideological commitments. However, these missions came at a profound cost. While they bolstered Cuba's international prestige and secured allies, they also resulted in significant Cuban casualties, estimated in the thousands. The enormous financial burden of sustaining overseas military operations for years strained the Cuban economy. Some historians argue these actions solidified Soviet-Cuban ties, while others believe they overextended the island's resources. Ultimately, Castro's project of exporting revolution left a complex legacy of both ideological triumph and heavy sacrifice. Yet while Castro's international ambitions carried such heavy costs abroad, his very survival at home faced constant threats from powerful enemies. Fidel Castro's survival through numerous assassination plots became a legendary aspect of his long rule. Declassified documents and subsequent investigations have revealed that the Central Intelligence Agency orchestrated an astonishing number of attempts on his life. One of the most bizarre schemes involved a box of poisoned cigars, intended to be lethal upon contact with his lips. Another intricate plan centered on contaminating his diving gear with a deadly toxin, ensuring the poison would be absorbed through his skin during a swim. These operations were part of a broader, covert campaign to destabilize the Cuban government. The methods employed were both creative and relentless. Plotters considered everything from exploding seashells placed in his favorite diving spots to a toxic milkshake. One particularly infamous episode involved a potential assassin using a pen syringe designed to deliver a fatal injection. Analysis of declassified records indicates that the total number of known plots reached an estimated 600, a figure that underscores the persistent determination of his adversaries. The sheer variety of these attempts, from the technologically sophisticated to the deceptively simple, painted a picture of a continuous shadow war. Despite the overwhelming odds, Castro consistently evaded every trap. He famously reflected on his improbable survival with a wry sense of irony. He was quoted as saying, "If surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic event, I would win the gold medal." This statement, while humorous, highlighted a stark reality. The cumulative effect of so many failed plots led some analysts to conclude that the efforts ultimately bolstered his image as an untouchable revolutionary leader, a commander who defied the most powerful nation on earth through a combination of shrewd intelligence, loyal security, and perhaps sheer luck. Yet beyond this narrative of political survival, his legacy would be built upon a very different kind of foundation. Following the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro's government initiated sweeping reforms in education and healthcare. These sectors became fundamental pillars of the new social contract, promising universal access as a right of citizenship. The regime's first major campaign targeted illiteracy, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of volunteer teachers. In just 1 year, from 1960 to 1961, this national effort reportedly reduced the illiteracy rate dramatically. Research indicated the rate fell to just under 4%, a figure often cited as a monumental achievement. The educational transformation extended far beyond basic literacy. The government heavily invested in expanding the university system, creating new institutions and broadening access to higher education for previously marginalized populations. Enrollment numbers grew substantially throughout the 1960s and 70s. Furthermore, a significant focus was placed on developing medical schools to address a domestic doctor shortage and to build a system of international medical diplomacy. The number of physicians trained in Cuba increased manyfold, forming the backbone of a new primary healthcare model. In healthcare, the state established a universal, free at the point of service system. The focus shifted from urban, curative medicine to a community-based model emphasizing prevention. This involved deploying thousands of new doctors and nurses to rural areas that had historically been neglected. Analysis has shown that these policies led to rapid improvements in key public health indicators. Infant mortality saw a steady decline, and life expectancy increased noticeably within a few decades. While some observers credit these reforms with creating a highly equitable system, others point to subsequent challenges related to resource constraints. Nonetheless, these reforms in education and health became defining features of Castro's Cuba, deeply embedding the state in the social welfare of its citizens. Yet these very successes in social welfare would soon face their ultimate test as economic realities began to shift in unexpected ways. Cuba's economy under Fidel Castro's leadership faced profound structural challenges from its inception. The nation's heavy reliance on Soviet economic assistance became a cornerstone of its stability for decades. This dependency was compounded by the comprehensive United States embargo, initiated in the early 1960s, which severely restricted Cuba's access to major markets and financial systems. For many years, the island's economic health was directly tied to favorable trade agreements with the Soviet bloc, exchanging Cuban sugar for Soviet oil and manufactured goods. This relationship cushioned the economy but created a vulnerability that would be starkly exposed later. The initial economic model was overwhelmingly centered on sugar production, aiming for a massive harvest of 10 million tons in 1970. Although this target was not fully met, the attempt underscored a monocultural focus that left the economy exposed to global commodity price swings. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Cuba entered an exceptionally difficult period known as the Special Period in a time of peace. This crisis forced a radical reevaluation of economic strategy. The government cautiously introduced limited market mechanisms, allowing some self-employment and opening the door to international tourism, which became a vital new source of revenue. Subsequent years saw a slow move toward diversification. Efforts were made to develop sectors like biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, achieving notable successes in producing and exporting vaccines. However, analyses have shown that these achievements existed alongside persistent problems. The dual currency system, which lasted for decades, created significant social inequalities and economic distortions. While some researchers point to the survival of the state-sponsored welfare model as a major accomplishment, others highlight that chronic inefficiencies in agriculture led to continued reliance on expensive food imports. The fundamental tension between revolutionary ideology and pragmatic economic necessity remained a central, unresolved feature of Cuba's economic landscape throughout the comandante's tenure. Yet even as these economic contradictions persisted, the revolution was simultaneously reshaping society in ways that would prove equally consequential. The revolutionary government initiated profound cultural and social transformations. In the sphere of race relations, Fidel Castro's administration declared the elimination of institutional racism a key goal. Public spaces were desegregated and discriminatory practices were outlawed. These measures significantly improved opportunities for Black Cubans in education and employment. However, some scholars argue that structural inequalities and underrepresentation in leadership persisted, creating a complex legacy. Women's rights experienced a dramatic shift. The Cuban Constitution of 1976 explicitly guaranteed gender equality. The Federation of Cuban Women, founded in 1960, mobilized women for the revolution and literacy campaigns. The government enacted the landmark Family Code in 1975, which legally obligated men to share domestic duties. These policies fostered unprecedented female participation in the workforce and higher education, fundamentally altering traditional gender roles. Artistic expression followed a turbulent path. The early 1960s saw state-supported cultural flourishing, with the creation of institutions like the Cuban Institute of Cinematographic Art and Industry. This period celebrated art as a tool for revolutionary ideals. However, by the late 1960s, a phase known as the Gray Quinquennium began. State censorship intensified, targeting homosexual artists and those whose work was deemed insufficiently revolutionary. This led to the marginalization of many prominent figures. The tension between state control and creative freedom remained a defining feature of Cuban cultural life for decades. While these cultural tensions simmered, a far greater geopolitical shift was about to fundamentally reshape the island's entire reality. The sudden dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 severed Cuba's economic lifeline with catastrophic speed. For 3 decades, the island had operated within a protected trade bloc, receiving substantial subsidies and favorable terms for its key exports, primarily sugar. Overnight, this arrangement vanished. The loss was staggering. Analysis revealed that Soviet economic assistance, including direct subsidies and above-market prices for Cuban goods, evaporated, creating an immediate financial abyss. The collapse of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or COMCON, erased 85% of Cuba's foreign trade almost instantly. This triggered an unprecedented crisis known as the Special Period in peacetime. The most severe shock was the catastrophic loss of oil imports, which fell by over 90%. This paralyzed the nation's transportation and agricultural systems, leading to widespread blackouts and food scarcity. Research from the period showed the Cuban economy contracted by at least 35% between 1989 and 1993. The gross domestic product was cut by more than a third, a collapse comparable to the Great Depression in the United States. Daily life became a relentless struggle for survival. The average Cuban's caloric intake plummeted, with reports indicating many survived on less than 2,000 calories per day. Public transportation ground to a halt, forcing people to walk or cycle for miles. Factories shuttered and essential goods vanished from state-run stores. As one economist wrote, the island was thrown back decades in terms of its material conditions. While some argue the crisis forced a degree of agricultural innovation, others maintain the human cost was devastating, with long-term health consequences for the population. The special period tested the resilience of the Cuban people and their revolutionary system like no event before it. Yet from this crucible of deprivation emerged a remarkable story of adaptation, as both government and citizens developed ingenious responses to their new reality. Facing unprecedented economic challenges following the loss of its primary trading partner, the Cuban government implemented a series of survival strategies. These measures were designed to navigate the severe shortages of the 1990s. A period Cubans refer to as the Special Period. The state introduced limited market reforms to generate essential foreign currency. In 1993, it legalized the possession of the United States dollar, which had been circulating in a black market. The following year saw the creation of agricultural markets where farmers could sell surplus produce directly to the public at market prices, a significant departure from the fully state-controlled system. A pivotal strategy was the aggressive development of the tourism sector. The government invested heavily in building new hotels and restoring historic areas in Havana and other cities. Joint ventures with foreign companies were established to manage these new facilities. This focus proved successful. By the end of the decade, tourism had become a primary source of hard currency, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors annually and creating a new, visible sector of the economy. The revenue was crucial for financing essential imports. Simultaneously, the country underwent a remarkable agricultural transformation out of sheer necessity. With petroleum and fertilizer imports drastically reduced, Cuba pivoted to organic farming methods. Urban agriculture flourished, with vacant city lots being converted into community gardens, known as organoponicos. Researchers developed biopesticides and promoted crop rotation to maintain soil health. These innovations were critical for increasing local food production despite the scarcity of traditional agricultural inputs. Despite the extreme economic conditions, the government prioritized maintaining universal access to basic healthcare and education. Rationing systems for food and other necessities were kept in place to ensure a minimum level of distribution for all citizens. While quality and availability fluctuated, the state's commitment to these social services provided a crucial safety net. Some analysts argue this focus on social welfare was key to maintaining social stability throughout the crisis, while others point to the hardships and inequalities that persisted. Yet beneath this fragile stability, forces were gathering that would reshape the nation's political landscape in ways few could have predicted. The special period generated profound political consequences for Cuba's system. Research showed this economic crisis created unprecedented social strain. Dissent visibly increased through rare public protests. The most significant occurred in August 1994 along Havana's waterfront. Thousands expressed frustration through street demonstrations. These marked the first major anti-government gatherings since the revolution's early days. Migration waves became another critical consequence. The 1994 rafter crisis saw over 30,000 Cubans attempt to reach the United States by sea. This exodus represented both humanitarian tragedy and political statement. Many participants were young professionals seeking opportunities elsewhere. Ideological challenges emerged as the government's revolutionary narrative faced skepticism. Some citizens questioned socialist principles during extreme scarcity. Studies revealed declining participation in official mass organizations. The system nevertheless survived when other communist governments collapsed. Analysts identified several sustaining factors beyond previously discussed reforms. Cuba's leadership maintained military and internal security cohesion. The government also carefully managed limited political openings. It allowed slightly greater religious freedom while containing organized opposition. Some scholars emphasize Cuba's unique geopolitical position. Unlike Eastern European states, it faced no direct border with Western powers. Others point to the population's fear of complete chaos. Many citizens preferred stability despite hardships. The revolutionary generation's gradual passing also reduced immediate pressure for radical change. These combined elements created a complex political landscape that endured through extraordinary challenges. But how did this enduring political landscape shape Cuba's most critical international relationship? Over the following decades, United States-Cuba relations evolved dramatically across 7 presidential administrations. President Dwight Eisenhower initially recognized Fidel Castro's revolutionary government in 1959. Tensions escalated quickly. The United States imposed a partial economic embargo in 1960. It severed diplomatic relations in January 1961. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion 3 months later cemented Cuban alignment with the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Subsequent decades saw a hardened stalemate. The embargo became nearly total under the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, yet migration became a recurring theme. The Mariel boat lift in 1980 saw 125,000 Cubans reach Florida. This led to the 1994 Migration Agreement. It established the wet foot, dry foot policy. Another brief thaw occurred in the late 1990s. The Clinton administration eased some travel and remittance restrictions. Analysis shows Castro's strategy was one of resilient defiance. He leveraged Soviet patronage for decades. After the USSR's collapse, he decried the special period, but held firm. He often used American hostility to justify domestic political control. Some researchers argue his government skillfully used migration as a pressure valve and negotiating tool. The Alien Gonzalez custody battle in 2000 exemplified how Castro could mobilize national sentiment against the United States. The 21st century introduced new dynamics. President Barack Obama and Cuban leader Raul Castro announced a historic thaw in December 2014. They restored full diplomatic relations in July 2015. Obama became the first sitting U.S. president to visit Havana in 88 years. This opening reversed a policy framework that had defined the bilateral relationship for over half a century. It marked the most significant shift since the revolution itself, though many restrictions remained in place. While this diplomatic opening reshaped Cuba's relationship with its northern neighbor, it also created space for the island to expand its influence across Latin America. During the pink tide era of the early 2000s, Fidel Castro emerged as a pivotal elder statesman for Latin America's resurgent left. His decades of experience governing Cuba provided a template for new socialist and social democratic projects across the region. Scholars note that his mentorship was particularly influential in shaping the political ideologies of a new generation of leaders, creating a network of solidarity that countered traditional hemispheric power dynamics. His relationship with Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, forged in the late 1990s, became the cornerstone of this alliance. Their partnership evolved into a strategic symbiosis. Venezuela supplied Cuba with heavily subsidized oil, crucial for its economy. In return, Cuba dispatched thousands of medical professionals and educational advisors to Venezuela. This model of cooperation was later extended to other allied nations, cementing Cuba's role as a key provider of social expertise. Similarly, Castro found a steadfast ally in Evo Morales following his electoral victory in Bolivia in 2005. Cuba immediately offered support, launching Operation Miracle to provide free ophthalmological surgeries to Bolivian citizens. This initiative was part of a broader pattern where Cuban medical brigades and literacy teachers became a common presence in nations with left-leaning governments, from Nicaragua to Brazil under Lula da Silva. Analysts describe this soft power strategy as a masterstroke, enabling the small island nation to exert significant influence by addressing fundamental human needs. The exchange was not merely transactional, it fostered deep diplomatic bonds and a shared political identity that defined the era's progressive bloc. This regional influence through humanitarian programs would soon find expression on a much larger global stage. Fidel Castro assumed a prominent leadership role within the non-aligned movement starting in the 1970s. His election as the movement's chairman in 1979 marked a significant period of his international influence. Castro utilized this platform to champion the collective interests of developing nations, often referred to as the Global South. He consistently argued for a more equitable international economic order, positioning Cuba as a vocal critic of neocolonialism and global inequality. His powerful oratory skills were frequently displayed at major international forums. During the United Nations General Assembly sessions, particularly his lengthy address in 1979, Castro delivered scathing critiques of imperialism and the existing global power structure. He used these speeches to call for debt relief for poor nations and the transfer of technology from developed to developing countries. Analysts noted that his rhetoric resonated deeply with many member states who felt marginalized by the Cold War superpowers. Through his activism, Castro effectively positioned Cuba as a defiant voice for smaller nations. He framed the non-aligned movement not merely as a neutral bloc, but as an active force for global change. This diplomatic strategy enhanced Cuba's international standing far beyond its size and economic power. While some observers viewed his approach as overly confrontational, others credited him with bringing critical issues of development and sovereignty to the forefront of global discourse. His leadership left a lasting, though debated, imprint on the movement's direction for decades. Yet this diplomatic influence stood in stark contrast to the very personal charisma that made it possible. Fidel Castro commanded attention through his legendary oratory. His public speeches often lasted for many hours, with his longest recorded address continuing for 7 hours and 10 minutes. Researchers note his powerful rhetorical techniques were central to his influence. He skillfully employed repetition for emphasis and used direct, simple language that resonated with common citizens. His speeches were not merely read but performed with immense physical energy. His physical presence was a key component of his charisma. Castro typically appeared in his iconic military fatigues, projecting an image of a revolutionary leader. He used dramatic pauses and forceful gestures to underscore his points, maintaining eye contact with vast crowds. This created a palpable connection with his audience, making each individual feel personally addressed. Analysis has shown his ability to gauge public sentiment and adapt his delivery accordingly was exceptional. One of his most famous speeches was the "History Will Absolve Me" defense, delivered in 1953 during his trial. This address laid out his political vision and became a foundational text for his movement. Another pivotal moment was his lengthy speech in Havana in 1959, celebrating the revolution's victory. In these and countless other appearances, Castro used oratory not just to inform but to mobilize entire nations, cementing his status as the definitive voice of his cause for nearly 5 decades. Yet for all his public visibility as a charismatic speaker, the true nature of his authority was exercised far from the podium. Through a system of intensely personal control, Fidel Castro exercised direct personal control over Cuba's governance through a highly centralized system. He maintained parallel oversight of both Communist Party and state institutions, personally reviewing decisions across all government ministries. This approach created what analysts called a system of personalized vertical power. Castro's working habits reflected this micromanagement style, with his famously nocturnal schedule involving marathon sessions reviewing documents and meeting officials. He would often intervene directly in provincial affairs, sometimes bypassing local authorities to issue commands to municipal leaders. His information processing methods combined exhaustive briefings with unconventional channels. Castro received detailed daily reports from multiple government agencies while also cultivating informal networks of informants. This allowed him to cross-reference official information with ground-level observations. Research indicates he processed enormous volumes of data, reportedly reviewing up to 200 pages of documents nightly. His decision-making style blended this systematic information intake with sudden intuitive leaps, sometimes catching his own advisors by surprise. The command structure ultimately flowed through Castro's personal secretariat rather than formal institutional channels. Important policy decisions frequently emerged from late-night discussions in his office rather than through cabinet meetings. Some observers noted this created efficiency in crisis situations but hampered long-term planning. Castro's hands-on approach extended to remarkably detailed domains, from agricultural techniques to military deployments. This governing method ensured his direct imprint remained on Cuba's development trajectory for nearly 5 decades, though analysts debate whether it ultimately strengthened or constrained the nation's institutional capacity. Yet behind this very public control of national affairs lay a man whose private world was deliberately kept in shadow, a duality that would define his legacy just as profoundly. Fidel Castro's personal life was largely shielded from public view, creating a stark contrast with his omnipresent public image. He was married twice and had several children, though details about his family relationships remained intensely private. His daily routine was famously demanding, often beginning late at night and extending into the early morning hours for work. For hobbies, he was an avid reader and enjoyed playing baseball and fishing, activities that offered rare glimpses into the man behind the commander. His public persona was meticulously crafted. The olive green military uniform and full beard became iconic symbols of the Cuban Revolution, projecting an image of unwavering commitment and austere living. This distinctive look, adopted in the late 1950s, was maintained for decades, becoming synonymous with his leadership. Researchers note this was a deliberate strategy to cultivate an image of a dedicated revolutionary, perpetually on duty for his nation. This cultivated image, however, often clashed with private realities. While publicly espousing a life of Spartan simplicity, some accounts from close aides described a lifestyle that included fine food and secure, comfortable residences. This tension between the public revolutionary and the private individual fueled much analysis. Some observers believe this duality was a necessary part of maintaining his political mythos, while others argue it revealed the inherent contradictions of a complex leader living under constant public scrutiny. Yet this carefully maintained image would soon face its greatest challenge, as whispers began to emerge about a different kind of struggle entirely. Our journey into the life and legacy of Fidel Castro, El Comandante, comes to an end. From his early years in Beirut and his Jesuit education to his university political awakening, we traced his arc through early political activities and the pivotal Moncada barracks attack. His subsequent imprisonment and exile set the stage for the Granma landing and the arduous guerrilla warfare in the Sierra Maestra, culminating in the final offensive and victory. We examined his early reforms and the ensuing opposition, alongside his transition to Marxism-Leninism. The text covered the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, his efforts in exporting revolution, and his survival of numerous assassination attempts. Significant focus was placed on education and healthcare reforms. as well as economic challenges and the solutions he implemented. We also explored the cultural and social transformations, the impact of the Soviet collapse, his survival strategies, and the political consequences. The evolution of U.S.-Cuba relations. His leadership in Latin America and the non-aligned movement were discussed, as were his methods of governing and decision-making. The narrative touched upon his personal life and public image, declining health, and the transfer of power to Fidel Castro. Finally, we considered his final years and writings, his death and global reactions, and assessed the revolution's lasting impact and Castro's place in history. Subscribe to our channel to not miss new episodes. See you in the next episodes.